In November of 2011, police entered a cramped apartment in the city of Nizhny Novgorod. At first, it looked like the home of an obsessive scholar. Books climbed toward the ceiling. Maps, papers, and old photographs covered almost every available surface. And among all that clutter sat a collection of figures, dressed like large, handmade dolls. Then the officers looked closer. They were not dolls. Police would report finding 29 figures inside the apartment and a nearby garage. Some later accounts placed the confirmed number at 26, but every version agreed on the truth that mattered most. Dozens of graves had been violated, and human remains had been hidden in plain sight. The man at the center of the discovery was not an unknown drifter, and he was not accused of causing any of the deaths.
He was Anatoly Moskvin, a respected local historian, a linguist, and possibly the most knowledgeable cemetery researcher in the entire region. He was the kind of expert investigators might have asked for help. Instead, his knowledge had helped him keep a secret for years. How did a man devoted to recording forgotten lives cross the line from studying the dead to taking control of them? How could a home filled with books conceal something so disturbing? And why did one of Russia's strangest criminal investigations end not with a conventional trial, but with a decision that courts would continue reviewing for more than a decade? This is the story of Anatoly Moskvin, the scholar whose private obsession transformed cemeteries from places of memory into scenes of a second, devastating loss. Long before the police search, Moskvin had built a reputation around knowledge. Born in 1966, in the city then known as Gorky, he grew into a highly educated, private man. He studied linguistics, Celtic history and culture, and reportedly 13 foreign languages. He wrote, researched place names, and collected enormous amounts of information. His apartment reflected that life: crowded shelves, stacked papers, and the evidence of a mind unwilling to throw anything away. But cemeteries were his defining subject. Most visitors see a cemetery as a quiet final destination. Moskvin treated one as an archive. A weathered headstone could become the beginning of a biography. A family name could lead into the history of a village. A symbol carved into stone could reveal a forgotten custom. In a 2007 interview, he claimed that he had inspected 752 cemeteries. He said he sometimes walked as far as 20 miles in a day. His journeys took him through cities, small towns, and isolated rural burial grounds. He recorded inscriptions and researched the people behind them. This work had real historical value. Cemeteries can preserve stories that disappear from official records, and Moskvin seemed determined to rescue them from obscurity. He published articles about burial grounds and became an authority on local history. That reputation matters, because it explains why his presence near a grave did not automatically look suspicious. A stranger wandering among headstones might attract attention. A recognized historian taking notes could be dismissed as simply doing his work. Expertise became a kind of camouflage. Moskvin later connected his fascination with death to an upsetting funeral encounter from childhood. That was his explanation, offered years after the event. It cannot tell us exactly when academic curiosity became something more dangerous. There is also a trap in looking backward. Eccentric habits are not evidence of a crime, and an interest in cemeteries does not make someone threatening. Thousands of historians, genealogists, and preservationists do similar work with care and respect. What separated Moskvin was not the subject he studied. It was the boundary he chose to cross. Across Nizhny Novgorod and surrounding areas, families began encountering signs that graves had been disturbed. Some markers and nameplates were missing. Burial sites appeared to have been tampered with. The incidents were not limited to a single cemetery, which made the pattern harder to understand and the person responsible harder to find. For relatives, the damage was deeply personal. A burial place is more than earth and stone. It is a promise that someone who has died can finally rest undisturbed, and a place where the living can return to remember them. Someone was breaking that promise. Police opened a long-running investigation into grave desecration. Exactly how their attention finally settled on Moskvin remains unclear. Early news reports offered two different accounts. One said that he was detained at a cemetery. Another claimed that investigators visited him because of his expertise and discovered the truth while seeking his advice. The contradiction is important. True crime stories often become cleaner with repetition, but real investigations rarely begin with a perfect cinematic moment. What is certain is that, in 2011, police searched his property, and the mystery of the disturbed grave suddenly moved indoors. Inside the apartment were the large figures that initially resembled old-fashioned dolls. They wore bright clothing, scarves, wigs, and other decorations. Their appearance had allowed them to blend into the extraordinary clutter of Moskvin's home. But investigators determined that the figures contained remains removed from graves. The discovery changed the meaning of everything around them. Maps were no longer simply maps. Cemetery records were no longer only research. Photographs, markers, and notes could now connect a respected historian's private world to burial sites across the region. Police announced that 29 such figures had been found in the apartment and garage. Later reports sometimes referred to 26 recovered bodies. The difference may reflect the confusing early stages of the investigation or how authorities counted and confirmed what they discovered. Rather than pretend the reporting is perfectly consistent, it is more accurate to say that police found dozens, with 29 being the number announced in 2011. Each one represented a person whose family believed the burial had brought an end to uncertainty. Now those families had to face it again. Moskvin lived with his parents, and reports said they believed the figures were handmade dolls. To outsiders, that claim can seem impossible. Yet the apartment was crowded, Moskvin's collecting habits were extreme, and the figures had been deliberately presented as objects. There is no reliable evidence that his parents participated in the grave violations. Their account instead reveals another unsettling feature of the case: people can share an address without fully sharing a reality. Moskvin controlled the meaning of what filled his rooms. To his parents, there were dolls among mountains of books. To investigators, there was evidence of a hidden campaign against graves. Once questioned, Moskvin reportedly acknowledged removing remains from cemeteries. He did not describe himself as a criminal stealing from grieving families. In his own mind, he had built a different story. He referred to the figures as daughters. Reports said he spoke to them, observed birthdays, and included them in the ordinary routines of the home. He also expressed the belief that future science might somehow return them to life. These statements were not evidence of affection. They showed how completely his private beliefs had erased the rights of the people he claimed to care about and the rights of their families. This is where sensational headlines can hide the real nature of a case. Words such as collection and dolls make the story sound like a dark curiosity, something almost separated from ordinary human grief. But these were not strange objects waiting to be catalogued. They were people. Many had been young when they died. They had names, histories, and relatives who had chosen clothes, attended funerals, placed flowers, and trusted that a grave would remain a protected space. Moskvin turned those family decisions into material for a fantasy that existed only for him. He had once appeared to honor forgotten lives by researching them. But genuine remembrance accepts limits. A historian can read an inscription, preserve a photograph, or write down a name. He cannot claim ownership of the person. Moskvin crossed from documentation into control. He selected graves, removed what families had buried, and reshaped the evidence of real lives to fit roles in his imagined household. That contradiction is the dark center of the story. The man who knew more than almost anyone about the meaning of burial customs was also the man willing to ignore what burial meant to the living. Investigators faced an unusual legal problem. Moskvin had not been accused of killing the people whose remains were discovered. The deaths had occurred separately, before his crimes began. The allegations against him concern the desecration of graves and the mistreatment of human remains under Russian law. That distinction does not reduce the harm. It makes the case different from the murder stories with which it is often grouped. The police did not uncover a hidden serial killer. They uncovered a serial violation of burial sites, carried out by someone whose specialist knowledge helped him move through cemeteries unnoticed. A psychiatric evaluation concluded that Moskvin had paranoid schizophrenia and was not competent to stand trial. In 2012, a court ordered compulsory treatment in a psychiatric hospital rather than a conventional criminal sentence. That legal finding requires careful language. It did not declare that nothing had happened, and it did not restore what families had lost. It meant the court believed Moskvin could not adequately understand or participate in criminal proceedings at that time. It is also important not to turn a diagnosis into a warning label. Most people living with schizophrenia are not violent. A diagnosis can help explain a court's decision. It should never be used to stigmatize millions of people who have committed no crime. Compulsory treatment is reviewed over time. Doctors assess the patient, and courts decide whether the order should continue or change. In Moskvin's case, that process went on year after year. Reports about possible release periodically appeared, creating new fear for families connected to the desecrated graves. Courts repeatedly continued his treatment. In December of 2025, local court reporting said a closed hearing in Nizhny Novgorod extended the compulsory measures for another 6 months, into June of 2026. More than 14 years after the apartment search, the legal consequences of the discovery were still being reviewed. The passage of time can make a notorious case feel like folklore. The details are repeated, the photographs become familiar, and the nickname attached to the suspect begins to replace the people who were harmed. But the families did not experience a legend. They experienced a second disappearance. Burial is supposed to end the search. It gives grief location. When a grave is opened and its contents removed, the family loses that certainty. A place meant for remembrance becomes another unanswered question. That is why the emotional weight of this case cannot be measured only by the number police reported. People asked how so many figures could remain in the apartment without discovery. Yet secrets sometimes survive because an ordinary explanation is available. Moskvin was known to collect books, papers, and unusual historical objects. His rooms were already outside what most visitors would consider normal. In that setting, one more strange object could disappear into the background. The disguise was not only clothing. It was context. Everything looked unusual, so nothing unusual demanded a closer look. His reputation offered a similar kind of protection. If someone saw him near a cemetery, he had an explanation. If he knew obscure details about a grave, that was his profession. If his home contained burial records, that was research. None of those facts proved wrongdoing by itself. Together, however, they gave him access, knowledge, and credibility. The same expertise that made him valuable to local history also made his actions harder to recognize. The case is disturbing because the mask was not completely false. Moskvin really was a scholar. He really did possess rare knowledge. The hidden crime existed beside those truths, not in place of them. We often imagine that a dangerous secret will announce itself through obvious contradictions, and that a respected public identity must be entirely fake. Reality can be more complicated. A person's genuine talent does not guarantee judgment, compassion, or character. Knowledge can preserve history, but knowledge without respect can also become a tool for invasion. Moskvin did not need to pretend he understood cemeteries. He understood them extremely well. What he failed to accept was that understanding a person's history does not create a right to possess that person. A name on a headstone is an invitation to remember, not permission to take. A grave may stand in a public cemetery, but the trust surrounding it is deeply private. And the dead do not become available simply because they can no longer object. The investigation also exposed the danger of a story told entirely from the offender's point of view. He described daughters and imagined rescue, as though intention could redefine action. They could not. Good intentions cannot exist only in the mind of the person claiming them. They must recognize the freedom, dignity, and boundaries of others. Moskvin's fantasy required families to lose what they had buried and required the identities of the deceased to be replaced by roles he had chosen. Whatever tenderness he imagined was inseparable from control. When police entered the apartment in 2011, they did more than solve a pattern of disturbed graves. They brought two versions of Anatoly Moskvin into the same room. There was the public historian, surrounded by the tools of research. And there was the private man, surrounded by the result of boundaries he had erased. The shock of the case came from realizing that both versions were real. The photographs of the apartment may be what first captures attention. The number 29 may be what viewers remember. But the most important fact is quieter. Behind every figure was a family that had already said goodbye. Anatoly Moskvin forced those families to confront loss again, not because the past had returned, but because someone who claimed to study memory had refused to respect it. More than a decade later, the case remains difficult to place into any familiar category. It is not a murder investigation, although it is often discussed beside one. It is not merely a story about an unusual collector, because people are not objects. And it is not simply a story about mental illness, because a diagnosis should not be made into a spectacle. It is a story about knowledge separated from empathy, grief violated after the funeral, and the frightening ease with which expertise can persuade others to stop asking questions. In Nizhny Novgorod, Anatoly Moskvin spent years reading the messages carved into stone. He learned the names. He traced the histories. He understood how the living tried to preserve the dead. And then, behind the walls of an apartment filled with books, he betrayed the very meaning of remembrance. Because the purpose of remembering someone is not to keep them for yourself. It is to honor the life that was theirs. If this story held your attention, subscribe for more carefully researched crime documentaries that focus not only on what happened, but on the people and choices behind the headline. And tell us in the comments, what disturbed you most about this case? The hidden apartment, the years of undetected grave violations, or the way Moskvin's respected reputation helped conceal the truth?